Hi, I'm Heather McKee Hurwitz and the author of this book, Are We the 99%? The Occupy Movement, Feminism, and Intersectionality. And I'm so thrilled to be here today and tell you a little bit how I came to write this book and to hopefully entice you to pick it up at the library and read it. So I'm originally from Cleveland. Born and raised on the east side, but now I'm a west sider, just down the street from you, a couple miles away in Rocky River. And I wrote this book, though, when I was not living in Cleveland. I left Cleveland for about 20 years. I started writing this book when the Occupy movement began. So that was back in 2011. The movement is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this fall. So another great reason to pick up the book and give it a read. Some of you might remember the Occupy movement. It began after a period of a lot of protest activity, in fact, from Wisconsin to Greece to in a really exciting way in Egypt and Tunisia. The Arab Spring occurred in 2010, flowed into 2011. And during this time, there were activists in the United States watching these protests very closely. And a number of them were based in New York City. And in the summer of 2011, they started to plan for what would become the Occupy movement. Their first protests happened September 17 of 2011 and quickly spread to San Francisco and many other places around the country. And in fact, right into Cleveland. There was an Occupy Cleveland as well. And I started to become interested in the movement at this time. I was a graduate student in California at University of California, Santa Barbara. I was studying social movements and I was studying feminism. And I thought that this idea of the Occupy movement was really intriguing. They were seeking to address economic inequalities. A lot of the strain of the Great Recession and the mortgage crisis of 2008 was still bearing down on so many people. This movement sought changes in banking, changes in the finance industry, and in that spirit of the Arab Spring, changes to our democracy. And I was really interested in that myself as someone kind of just starting on their career. I also wore a couple of other hats when I came to this movement and came to writing this book. So I was definitely a researcher. When I participated in the movement, I had a notebook with me. I was going up to lots of different people and trying to ask them about their experiences. And every night after joining the protest camps, which was really the signature kind of tactic of this movement, I would go home and download my notes and flesh them out and take copious field notes about what I had observed at the protests. So that really gave me a kind of objectivity, a kind of critical distance from the movement, while I was also participating in it and trying to support it as I could. But I did wear a third hat in this movement. So I was also coming at the movement as a feminist and as a feminist scholar. And I had learned so much about the history of feminism and the ways that women in many social movements, from the civil rights movement to anti-war movements and the New Left, and even in more recent movements, like movements around the World Social Forum and the anti-globalization movement, women had been, kind of marginalized. Aspects of gender issues and sexuality, LGBTQ issues, lesbian and gay issues had been kind of marginalized. And I went into the movement thinking about those things and wondering, could this movement of the 99% be doing something to get beyond those kinds of barriers and inequalities of other movements? an initial look around the movement, I saw people who seemed like they had different kinds of identities and a mix of people of different gender identities and racial identities. And so I came in wondering, what is this movement doing to create equality and inclusivity? And in what ways maybe is it still falling short? These are really deep inequalities in our society. Persistent, inequalities around race and gender especially. They're pretty hard to get over. And so I wondered, what could we learn from this movement? And so I wrote this book about all of the people that I met, the stories they shared with me, and many of the stories of people who maybe didn't really make it onto the news about the Occupy movement. A lot of the news coverage focused on more white men who were taking on some of the more prominent leadership roles in the movement. And I sought out especially women and genderqueer persons of a range of racial identities to speak with them. And these are a lot of their stories that you'll read in the book. And so I want to actually read you a part of the book, just a little kind of teaser. The book starts with me describing one of these Occupy encampments, and almost as if we're walking around the encampment, and I'm trying to show you and give you kind of the flavor of what these protest camps were like. And a few pages in, I get to this part and describing one particular group. One group wore pink armbands, emblazoned in black permanent marker with the words "safer spaces." Responding to early reports of sexism and racism within the encampment, this group called for Occupy Wall Street, or OWS, to be an anti-oppressive place for everyone. Led by feminists, the group organized trainings about racial justice. To prevent sexual violence, Safer Spaces members held workshops about the politics of consent. They shared their gender pronouns with each other, he, she, they. And this was really the first place that I encountered people sharing their gender pronouns. I think a number of people learned about this in the Occupy movement, and for some of you watching this video, maybe it's a little bit more second nature 10 years on. So they shared their gender pronouns with each other to signal their acceptance of gender diversity. Some wrote and distributed a community agreement about respecting people of all identities. Other Occupy movement participants marginalized people of color or even sexually harassed feminine participants. Safer Spaces responded by making an inclusive, separate space and creating a support team for any activists who believed that they needed it. As feminists who embraced the Occupy movement, but recognized some anti-feminist practices among its participants, they critiqued the movement's internal dynamics like an informal watchdog. Conscious of intersectionality, Safer Spaces participants were among many who argued that a movement to end economic inequality would necessarily need to eradicate gender, race, and sexual inequalities as well. So I chose that little excerpt to give you a sense of some of the tensions within the movement, some of the diverse groups that were a part of the movement, and maybe you've heard of Safer Spaces, but maybe you haven't. Part of my goal was to really find those groups who were participating in the movement, but maybe weren't the primary groups, but were making really important contributions and kind of pushing this movement forward. These encampments and the online forums and even the meetings that happened for this movement after those encampments were kind of destroyed in some cases or distributed and didn't last. these kinds of groups really were challenging and pushing the Occupy movement to be really a place for the 99%. And the book is called Are We the 99%? Because it was groups like Safer Spaces who said, okay, this is a movement about ending economic inequality. We definitely want to do that, but we've experienced gender and racial inequalities as well. And part of our desire for change is to end gender, racial, sexual, and class inequalities and other forms of inequalities. And so that idea of the 99%, does it really represent us? Does it really speak to those intersectional tensions? And when I use this word intersectionality, I think it's really important, and it's one of the key lessons that we can learn from the Occupy movement. So intersectionality is a term that Professor Kimberly Crenshaw developed in the late 80s, actually. And this term indicates that we need to consider people's identities and the various kinds of privileges and oppressions that they have on different and intersecting axes. So we can't just think about class inequality and someone's relative privilege or oppression based on class. We have to combine that with the racial inequalities that they endure and the particular maybe gender privileges that they might have, or their sexual or age privileges, or maybe limitations because of these mix of identities that come together and intersect to create a particular experience for each individual person. So intersectionality really helps us to think in more complex ways about inequality. And I found that there was a real tension within the movement of groups like Safer Spaces who wanted the larger Occupy movement to speak to not only that 99% identity really formed around a class identity, but think about the kind of intersection of other forms of inequality that really matter. And another one of those groups that you can read about in the book is the decolonize movement. And this movement was centered around bringing the history of racism in this country together with class inequality, really kind of focusing on that. They started this kind of campaign, which became a kind of breakout organization within the movement to address the name Occupy. They started from the perspective of Native American activists, and they said, you know, Native American activists have been fighting against occupation for hundreds of years. And now you want us to join a movement that is to occupy? This is really not the best name. This name doesn't make us feel included. It doesn't make us want to be a part of this movement. We need something that speaks to our experience and what we are bringing to this movement of really fighting occupation and colonization. And so the name emerged, decolonize. And this became a kind of movement within the Occupy movement to fight for racial justice and even to rename the movement. So the full renaming didn't happen, which you might know, but those tensions were there. And there were a lot of activities to support racial justice objectives. And this is part of where I think reading the book is important for especially young activists, or really anyone who's interested in the political history of the last 10 years of such vibrant activism in the United States. So the movement, this Occupy movement began in the fall of 2011. Soon after, in 2012, was the unfortunate and unjust killing of Trayvon Martin. And this was a moment that really galvanized some of the activists within the Occupy movement. They conducted hoodie marches in support of Trayvon Martin and his family and for justice. And we're joining in with some of the groundswell that was beginning that would later become the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, is built on a long history of racial justice organizing in the United States. But there were a number of activists active in the Occupy movement, already getting people into the streets in this period that joined in and added into that energy. And about a year later, in 2013, the three founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, all queer Black women, coined the name Black Lives Matter, and it was off and running. So there are threads of the Occupy movement that help us to understand today's activism. We wouldn't really have the Bernie Sanders groundswell of support without the Occupy movement. Bernie, of course, took the idea of the 1% versus the 99% popularized by Occupy and has run with it. And Black Lives Matter and Bernie Sanders are just a couple of examples of how this kind of genesis of street activism that started with the Occupy movement has in some ways contributed to, in some ways challenged, in some ways complicated some of the activism that's come on its heels. And so there's a lot to learn about the foundation of this period of activism by understanding the Occupy movement, and a lot of lessons that we can learn from Occupy. Just one of those is forming our movements to take in that intersectional perspective. It's a way to really build stronger inclusivity in movements, in our churches, in school organizations, in businesses. It can really have an effect even beyond just social movement organizations. There's other lessons to learn. I'll leave those up to you as you hopefully check the book out of the library and read it for yourself. And thank you so much for kind of celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Occupy with me today.